Welcome to this week. We are going to be covering Chapter 11, which is all about rape and sexual assault victimization. I will give you a forewarning that this topic is very triggering for some, so if you need to stop and kind of take a break and come back to it, please do it as you need to. The most important thing is to take care of yourself, but we do have to kind of go over this. This is a big part of victimization, and I think it would be neglectful to skip over this topic. So, as always, I will timestamp this, and you can go back and forth as you need. And I would encourage you to take notes. So let's go ahead and get started. So, rape and sexual assault are definitionally different things. Sexual assault and sexual violence are used interchangeably in this presentation, just FYI. But all states include some type of legislative statute that define that state's definition of what rape is and what sexual assault is. In general, the federal definition of rape is penetration, no matter how slight, of the vagina or anus with any body part or object, or oral penetration by a sex organ of another person without the consent of the victim. So please note that with rape, this definition applies to both males and females. Historically, when we've looked at rape and sexual assault, we've looked at it in the context of only females being victims. However, throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, there was really a movement to kind of recognize that males are also rape victims and victims of sexual violence. And so the statutory definition has changed over time to evolve to include those male victims. Sexual violence is defined as a sexual act committed against someone without the person's freely given consent. And so sexual violence takes on many forms. And I have those forms listed here. So you can see we have everything from unwanted sexual contact to completed or attempted alcohol and drug facilitated acts where the victim is made to be penetrated or to penetrate someone else or the perpetrator, all the way up to completed or attempted forced penetration of a victim. So all of these acts fall into the category of sexual violence. And if you look at these closely, you will note that rape falls into the broad category of sexual violence. So you will see sexual violence is your broad category and rape falls under that. It's more narrow as far as statutory definitions. So how do we measure the prevalence of rape and sexual violence in the United States? Well, we use two modern tools that we have talked about extensively in this class. The first is the Uniform Crime Report. The UCR collects data specifically on rape and forcible rape. But then we also use the NCVS, the National Crime Victim Survey, to kind of give us more information around the prevalence of rape. Because as you will see when we talk about reporting issues, not all rape is reported. And so those dark figures of crime that the UCR doesn't capture kind of comes more to light with the NCVS. And so I'm going to show you some of the most recent statistics around rape and sexual violence in general using the RAIN database, which you've read about. So let's see how prevalent rape and sexual violence is. Here are some staggering statistics. Every 68 seconds in America, someone is sexually assaulted. So not even every minute. It's every 68 seconds. 1 out of every 6 American women have been a victim of an attempted or completed sexual assault or rape in their lifetime, and 1 in 33 men have been a victim of sexual violence or rape. You will see that the general public, there was about 433,000 Americans aged 12 and older were sexually assaulted or raped. And then this one breaks it down as well to like it. You will read about military sexual violence and things like that. You'll see that there was about 18,900 victims of sexual violence / rape in the military. This was 2018, which was the most recent statistics. So you can see according to the 2018 stats. The majority of victims are female. So 9 out of 10 victims are female. 1 out of 10 are male, which is pretty consistent with empirical research that we see. So with those statistics, we have found that rape is pretty prevalent among females, and is pretty prevalent among our society, rape or sexual violence. But that come around with rape. And these myths can lead into some reporting issues that victims don't feel comfortable reporting, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But essentially, rape myths are prejudicial, stereotyped, or false beliefs about rape victims, or rapists. So I want you to think of some of the information about rape that you've heard. So a lot of our prevailing myths deal with false accusations or people wanting attention. There's also a lot of victim blaming that goes into rape myths, like only certain types of women are raped, or there's an offender victim dynamic of like strangers waiting in the woods or in the dark to grab you and rape you. There's also myths around the sexual history of victims. So we will talk about rape shield laws, which were advocated for in the 80s and 90s to kind of put in place so that the victim and the victim's sexual history wasn't put on trial. But essentially, a lot of the myth revolves around promiscuous individuals being more likely to be raped and not really considering it rape because of their promiscuous lifestyle. Well, the biggest thing and the biggest myth buster that I want you to leave this class with is that most rapes are committed by someone that the individual knows. The majority of rapes in the United States are committed by acquaintances. The individual has some type of relationship with the offender. So, Table 11.5, I'm not going to go through it individually, but I do want to bring it to your attention because in relation to phases of the rape. So rape typically has 3 phases, so the before, the during, and the after. And so you're going to see some of the rape attitudes and belief around so let's dive a little bit deeper. There are 5 types of sexual assault that we will cover and that you will need to be familiar with. These are detailed in your book, so I'm going to give you kind of an overview and you can read a little bit more in your book about them. So the first type is incest, and incest is essentially blood-related relatives being engaged in some type of sexual activity that is against the law. And all 50 states typically have some type of incest laws on the book where it is illegal. The next type of sexual assault is known as statutory rape. And I have linked the RAIN database to this week's material. And I want you to look at that material. As part of the databases that RAIN tracks, it tracks the statutory age of consent for every state. It also kind of tells you a little bit about Georgia laws in and of themselves. So statutory rape is essentially unforcible intercourse with a person who is younger than the statutory age of consent. Age of consent in Georgia is 16, and so typically you see stat rape for someone who in their teenage years. So that could be like a 14-year-old having sexual relations with a 17-year-old, something like that. It's when it's stat rape, it's typically handled in a misdemeanor way, not technically a felony. But there are still some reporting issues and things like that that come with stat rape charges. Now, there are certain vulnerability factors that exist when we look at stat rape cases. Essentially, there are 5 different risks that increase a victim's likelihood to type of relationship, a statutory rape. Victims who have conflict within their family and typically are estranged from their parents are at higher risk of stat rape. If a youth who does not have appropriate peer influences or doesn't have peer social relationships and seek out more adult type relationships. Youth who are sexually active are also higher risk of entering a statutory rape situation. And then LGBTQ youth are typically at higher risk of entering a statutory rape situation as well. Youth who are involved in statutory rape situations have extensive histories of abuse and relationship issues with their parents. That is empirical research, and it kind of shows us that in these situations, the younger individual may seek out approval or may seek out some type of affection from an older individual. Now, with stat rape, there are Romeo and Juliet laws and different factors that you can look up on RAIN as well that kind of influence sentencing decisions and things like that. The next type of sexual assault is something known as marital rape. And essentially, marital rape is non-consensual sex between spouses. Historically has not been recognized as a type of sexual assault. And it wasn't really until the 90s that we in the United States kind of took a stance on marital rape. Remember, historically, women were seen as property of their husbands and kind of were supposed to be subservient to their husbands. And so in the 80s, 70s, 80s, you really started to see when the rape movement picked up steam and kind of brought attention to the rape crisis that was going on throughout the nation, that you started to see more attention being brought to husband-wife relationships and recognition that rape could happen within that sacred bond. And in fact, in July of 1993, marital rape was officially outlawed in the United States. And so it was there. Every state in the United States has some type of law governing marital rape. The next type is acquaintance rape. And acquaintance rape is also known as date rape. You've probably heard of date rape and things like that. This is essentially unwanted intercourse between two individuals that have a relationship, whether it be intimate relationship, non-intimate relationship, but the victor-offender dynamic, they know each other. Acquaintance rape is the most common type of rape, and you will see sexual coercion happening in acquaintance rape, and you will see the victim not really recognizing that they were raped, or wanting to come to terms with the rape with this subsection of sexual assault. And then finally, you have sexual homicide, which is kind of like your serial murder and things like that that we've talked about. That specifically is your stranger homicide, like your stranger dynamic between the victim and the offender. You can read more about that, but I really kind of want you to remember that acquaintance rape is the most common type of rape that we see. So now that we've kind of looked at the typology of sexual assault, let's look at the rapist, and kind of understand how we classify the rapist individually and kind of the types of rapists there are. So to better appreciate what the rape victim has been through, it's helpful to understand more about the rapist, like what prompts the offenders to rape, who are these offenders, do they progress from levels of aggression, and do they choose their victims, or are victims a opportunistic victimization? Early research on rapists focused on kind of three main domains, and through empirical research found that there were three main domains that rapists kind of fell in, and the reasoning behind why they raped. And it all had to do with power, anger, and sexuality. So there was some sexual gratification out of the rape itself, but a lot of it was about power and releasing some type of anger. Clinical work throughout the 80s and 90s, though, revealed that rape is in fact serves primarily non-sexual needs. So this whole notion of the sexuality domain that Groth, Burgess, and Holmstrom found was questioned. Basic observation is that not all offenders are alike. However, a lot of offenders focused more on using rape as a tool of power and anger. Current research, which I believe we will talk about, so we don't right now. Current research focuses that rape is essentially all about control and power. And so we kept the power aspect. We still see some anger aspects in, but we know now that empirical research has backed up that rape is really about power and control. And so there are some distinguishable patterns of rape that become evident, and there are three major types of rape. You have the anger rape, which is where sexual becomes hostile, and you see more anger kind of permeating throughout that offense. You have power rape, which is sexuality expressed in a conquest. So with the power rapist, it's all about power and control, and like if the victim is subservient, that's fine, but if they fight back, then you start seeing issues escalating with violence and things like that. And then you have the sadistic rape, which is for anger and control as part of the erotic fantasy. So you see the sexuality aspect coming into the sadistic rapist, where the control aspect and the anger aspect are the turn-ons in that. So let's look at some of these a little bit more in depth. So the first one we're going to look at is known as the exploitative rape. This is your power rape. Essentially, it's a different name for power rape. But with power rape, you typically see that aggression is low, and it does not exceed beyond compliance. They only exert the amount of power that's needed to get the victim to comply with them. This type shows little skill in negotiating interpersonal relationships, and they feel inadequate in most of their life. So if you were profiling this type of rapist would have a lot of characteristics of the unorganized offender, in that mediocrity, not living up to expectations, things like that. The rape experience for the offender is one of anxiety, excitement, and anticipated pleasure in the exploitative rape. Again, the exploitative rape is all about power. It's also known as the power reassurance rape. So continuing with exploitative rape, these rapes are premeditated and preceded by obsessional fantasy and is almost always at odds with reality. Reality of the rape leaves him disappointed with the actual event, so he's built up this fantasy about rape, and obsession, kind of compulsion around the act of raping, and empowering the victim and bringing the victim into compliance. But the actual act itself leaves him disappointed because it was not fulfilling for him. These type of rapists are dangerous because they keep seeking that fantasy, and so these offenses become repetitive and compulsive over time. We also see some aspects of aggression increasing with each rape that's happening. The aggression is expressed less as anger and more as a means of domination. So again, exploitative rape is your power rape. It's all about power. The sexual fantasy of this rapist is all about overpowering and controlling the victim. And the exploitative rapist is all about proving themselves through the act of rape. So they may be impotent, they may be weak socially, but the fantasy of raping and being the rapist gives them a sense of power. And so during these type of events and during this typology, you see that rape becomes an assertion of their virility. which essentially means that's where they feel that they are the dominant. And they're proving their manhood, so to speak. So the next type of rapist is the anger rapist. This rapist is all about projecting anger and pent-up rage. And so you see excessive and unprovoked physical and verbal aggression even when the victim is complying. Rage is evident primarily and is the primary motive. These rapists are not about the fantasy. It's really evident that rage is the primary MO in these. Resistance from the victim will increase aggression, which results in more serious injury and even death. So the more the victim fights back with the anger rapist, the more likely they are to die. Just because this entire typology is about releasing pent-up anger and aggression. Relationship with women, with important women in his life, are fraught with conflict, irritation, and jealousy. Typically, with this person, they can never live up to standards that the women in their life set for them. And then finally, we have the sadistic rapist. The sadistic rapist, the assault appears ritualized and usually involves bondage or torture. So the sadistic rapist is the one that gets joy out of the suffering of the victim. So the power and control rapist, typically it's about the control, and they get the sexual gratification out of the control. The control is a major part of the fantasy. The anger rapist is about releasing pent-up aggression, and really you don't see a lot of ritualistic aspects of that rape, unless the victim fights back. And as compliance kind of dwindles from the victim, the more aggressive that rapist gets. The sadistic rapist is completely different. The sadistic rapist is all about rituals. So you see a lot of bondage, a lot of torture. You see certain areas of the victim may be targets of torture over like the full body. So like your sadistic rapist may target breast or genitals, but leave the rest of the victim alone. So you kind of see the ritualistic aspect of the act of rape itself. These victims are not victims of chance. These victims were deliberately picked, they were deliberately captured, and they were deliberately abused. And sadistic rape, unlike the other rape, do not have to involve the offender's genitals. In some case, there may not be intercourse at all. It may be more of the offender doing something to the victim. If there is intercourse in the sadistic rapist typology, it's going to be with the deceased body. It's not going to be with a live individual. All right, we looked at the three major rape typologies. Now we're going to turn our attention to sexual assault typologies. Remember, rape is an aspect of sexual assault, but is not as broad as sexual assault. So in order to understand truly the dynamics of sexual assault, we have to look at the different types of sexual assault there are. And we have categorized those really into rape, pressured sex, and stress situations. And so we're going to kind of take a look at those three more in depth and kind of hopefully better your understanding of those three. So rape is all about consent. And so this notion of consent is the ability of legal individuals to agree to enter a sexual relationship. When you take the consent of one individual away, it then becomes rape. And there are two main types of rape itself. We've talked about rapist typologies, but there are two main types of rape itself. The first type is blitz rape. And blitz rape is the type that comes out of the blue. There's no prior interaction between the victim and offender. A lot of times there's a blitz attack, so there will be a person walking down the street and the offender will grab them and rape them out of the blue, things like that. The other type is confidence rape. And confidence rape is all about the victim-offender dynamic and previous interactions. So in confidence rapes, the victim and offender have interacted before, and the offender obtains sex under false pretenses, deceit, betrayal, often violence. So your acquaintance rapes typically fall under confidence rapes because there is some type of relationship between the victim and offender. But the actual rape itself is obtained under some type of false pretenses. So you're going to read about college levels of rape and things like that in Title IX. But let's use the example of a boy and girl are friends, and the boy invites the girl over to help him study for a chemistry test. And while they are studying, the boy forces himself onto the girl. She does not consent. That then becomes a rape, and it's a confidence rape because his intention was to have sexual relations with her this whole time. And so you see that he lured her over to his place under the pretenses of studying for a chemistry test, and now he has forced himself upon her and raped her. Another example of this would be the beginnings of human trafficking. And so we see, I don't know if we see it as much anymore, but you used to see those signs on the side of the road about, hey, do you want a singing career? Come here, or something like that. And those typically were signs of human trafficking. But essentially, a naive person would show up thinking that they're going to cut a record deal, and they would be kind of finessed into maybe a recording, having lunch, things like that, and then being raped. So there's a interaction between the offender and victim, although brief, but there is an interaction in that scenario. But victim was lured there under false pretenses. So rape is your first major type of sexual assault. But then we have something called pressured sex. Sorry, I'm writing down timestamps. So we have something called pressured sex. And essentially pressured sex, we have this notion of consent again. And under pressured sex, the main difference is with rape, or they don't give consent. With pressured sex, they're not able to give consent. And so these are sexual acts that are against the victim's will, and they are forced by the assailant to do sexual acts. The assailant stands in some type of relationship of power over the victim. That is the key to this typology, this whole relationship of power. So with pressured sex, you typically see these when you're talking about boss, boss employee, teacher student, priest parishioner, those type of sexual assaults that you kind of see publicized a lot, where it's someone who is in a position of power manipulates someone else into an inappropriate relationship. There are three main ways that we access and kind of pressure a victim in these situations. And so you see those here. They typically will pressure the victim to take material goods, accept human contact, or believe that the sexual activity is appropriate and enjoyable. These type of acts are not perceived as negative at the time by the victim. So in a lot of inappropriate teacher-student relationships, in these type of situations, think of, you guys don't know Mary Kay Letourneau, that was way before your time, but she was a female teacher that had an inappropriate relationship with a student who was, I think, 14 or 15 at the time, was arrested and convicted of sexual assault, and they continued their inappropriate relationship and has several children now. But essentially, the 14-year-old boy did not perceive that he was being assaulted. He just thought an older woman was into him. And so you see that the psychological dynamic of the victim is a little bit different because they don't necessarily recognize the victimization aspect of the sexual contact. Okay, so our last scenario is known as your sex stress situation. And this is the only situation where consent was initially given. The perpetrator gained access with consent. Sorry, my phone is going crazy. It's clear that initially consent was given. Usually what went wrong was the assailant exploited this agreement in several ways. So you may see alcohol or drugs involved in these type of situations, and very few of these situations are taken to court or reported because there is some type of victim remorse and victim blaming themselves on these type of situations. All right. So we've gone over sexual abuse typologies. We've gone over rapist typologies. We've kind of defined what the difference between rape and sexual assault is. Now let's look at some reporting dynamics of the victim. We know that rape is a crime that is known as the hidden crime. because we know that a lot of rape victims don't report their crimes. There are different uh, schools of thoughts on why that is, but there are certain dynamics that we need to be aware of as far as barriers and thoughts around the different reporting dynamics. We know that if injuries exist, if another crime was committed during the rape, or if a weapon was used, those are the most likely situations in which a victim of a rape will report the rape. We also know that if it was a stranger victim dynamic, they are more likely to report the rape as well. A lot of empirical research shows that the reasoning for this is because the majority of rape is acquaintance rapes, and that we know. But it's the victim believing that the system won't believe them if it's just a rape, quote unquote, because there may not be evidence to support. They may feel like they caused it, believing some of the rape myths. So if injuries are present, they can physically show the police, I was injured during this rape. Or if another crime was committed, they have the evidence to kind of prove that this situation happened. There's a believability myth around rape victims that our society has perpetrated through rape mythology, and it really has hindered victims feeling confident and comfortable reporting their victimization. So what are some barriers that we see? Well, age and race are barriers. But then you start getting into was drugs or alcohol involved? What was the relationship with the offender? So remember, the majority of rapes are acquaintance rapes. So the victim and offender know each other and have had some type of relationship, which then we start talking about, did rape really happen in the mind of the victim? Like, was I really raped? Do I believe I was raped? They would never do that to me. I must have been dreaming, something like that. Also goes into the seriousness of the assault. So remember, if physical injury happens and there are physical marks, bruises, or broken bones, victims are more likely to report the rape than those who do not have any marks or bruises on them. The use of weapons, if there are weapons being utilized in the rape, there are more likely to report that. But then some of the strongest barriers to reporting are the perceived fears that victims have. So there's this fear of retaliation. If the offender is known to the victim might be afraid that they'll retaliate against them if they report. There's the shame and the fear of blame. So remember, rape mythology culture has rape victim blaming and a collective consciousness to be okay with questioning past possibly promiscuous endeavors of victims. And you'll see here in a minute that we've kind of put a stop to that in a lot of ways, but there's still that myth out there that the moral compass of the victim will be brought into question if this ever goes to trial or anything like that. So this is a chart, I think it's 11.4, that I want you to make sure you pay attention to. Are factors to reporting. So women who are older, more educated, and earn higher incomes are more likely to report sexual assault. Findings regarding race found that African American women are more likely to file sexual assault police reports, whereas other studies have found white women are more likely to do so. So you see some mixed results when we're looking at race. But the personal issues is the most important aspect of this chart. Fear of retaliation was the number one reason for victims not reporting. They feared that the offender would come back and get even with them. You also had shame and fear of blame. So remember in the 70s and 80s, there was an uprising to the collective consciousness that rape was an issue. And as part of the rape crisis movement, reform efforts were implemented to get system access to victims. And between 73 and 90, because of those reform efforts, we saw about a 10% increase in rape reports. And then in studies done in 2005, we saw that there was an 88% increase in likelihood of reporting these type of crimes. One of the major barriers was the fear of retaliation, but also the fear of the system and these rape myths that have permeated throughout our system that affects overall establishment of justice. And so you're going to read about rape shield laws. And essentially, rape shield laws came about primarily in the 90s. There was it was a slow movement, started in the 80s, but we primarily saw a lot of movement in the 90s around rape shield laws, in that women's past were going to be protected from coming in as a mitigating factor for the rape. So as the collective consciousness kind of shifted to victim blaming, rape shield laws were essentially enacted to help deviate that focus. I have provided you in folio with a list of kind of rape shield laws and where to find your rape shield laws and things like that. But the next slide is going to kind of show you some of the rape shield legislation. And essentially most states have some type of rape shield legislation on the books that protect bringing in women's past or men's past into trial, unless there is a specific reasoning for it. And make sure you kind of pay attention to that rape shield legislation. It's very interesting just to kind of see. RAIN, which is the website that I have, also has information on rape shield laws. Right, we have reached the end of the presentation. So I wanted to finish this presentation out with a discussion around Title IX. As you will read, college campuses have received a lot of focus in terms of rape and sexual assault over the past decade, with increasing instances of sexual assault and things like that. Well, in 1972, Title IX came about. And Title IX essentially prohibits discrimination on the basis of sex in all education programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. It essentially, the aim was to ensure equal distribution of women's athletic scholarships and funding women's sports, but it also increased funding and federal guidance around sexual abuse and rape issues. In 2011, our then Vice President, Joe Biden, sent a Dear Colleague letter to all university campuses that received federal funding. And essentially in this Dear Colleague letter, then Vice President Joe Biden outlined a comprehensive set of guidelines to universities and Title IX administrators around campus sexual assaults. And whether you know it or not, we have a Title IX department that handles these type of situations. I have linked the website in Folio, as well as provided you with the Title IX brochure. This office is there to help navigate any potential sexual assault incidents on campus. They gather statistics and data and report that to the federal government. You can see our Title IX statistics and things like that. But it's important for you to know that that resource is there. And if you ever fall victim, you know where to go. And so you have that information at your fingertips. So, all right, that's going to wrap our discussion this week. As always, take care of yourself when we're talking about this stuff. It's not easy stuff to talk about. Hope you guys have a great week. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, I will see you next week.